Hey guys, my name is Ryan, and today in Lightroom I'm going to show you how to recreate this photo from this one. Whoop. This one right here. Okay, so this is my first tutorial, so just be easy on me here. If this is something that you'd like to see more of, just shoot me a comment down below and maybe even give me a like on the video. So without further ado, let's get started. So step one, let's go ahead and reset it. And the first thing we want to look at is the exposure. So typically what I do is I dial down the exposure just a tiny bit, crank up the contrast just a tad. And in this one, I'm going to bring up the highlights. So maybe around here is pretty good. I'm also going to bring up the shadows. I know it's going to look a little weird, but we're going to dial those down. We're going to dial down the blacks in just a second. We're going to bring the whites down just a tad and the blacks down, and it's going to bring some of that contrast back. See how that works? Awesome. And I also like to add a little bit of clarity. So just like this, just drag it up until it starts to look right. You don't want to overdo this or it's going to start looking really weird. That looks pretty good. So I also like to do a little bit of dehazing. So if you notice right here, we got a lot of sunlight coming down on our subject. So to eliminate some of that coming through the lens, just drag up the dehaze just a tiny bit. Not too much, you don't want to flood it. Right there is pretty good. Maybe dial it down just a tad bit. Okay, good. The next thing is the vibrance and the saturation. So the difference between vibrance and saturation is saturation takes all the colors out entirely like this. Vibrance still keeps some of the colors. So if you notice, I'm dragging it all the way down, but you can still see some of the greens. You can still see just a tiny bit of the oranges and blues. I like using this more than I do saturation. I feel like I have more control over the colors. So I'm going to drag this down just a tiny bit because I don't want us to be overwhelmed with all the colors. So I'm going to take it down to about maybe 20. Okay, that looks good. So right now we have kind of a desaturated, not really desaturated, but kind of a little bit less color than we started with before. And what I like to do after this is, since this was taken around 6 p.m., the sun is still pretty high, but it's a lot softer. I kind of want to replicate the same kind of sunlight that I saw. So in order to do that, we're going to go over here to temperature, and we're going to take the Kelvin up just a touch right there. You don't want to set it on fire. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now we're going to go down. I'm going to touch on the curves just a little bit. So in this area is where you work with the darks, and up here is where the lights are. So essentially what I like to do is I like to create this little S. So if you just click it right here and then drag it to the right, it brings some of those darks down. You don't want to do it too much, just a little bit. About right there is pretty good. And then we're going to move up here and we are going to increase the highlights just a touch, not too much, just barely right there. And another little trick that I like to do, I'm sure you've seen some of the faded, that kind of matted black look. So the trick to that is create this extra point right below the dark area right here. Right there is good. And that kind of creates this anchor so it doesn't drag everything else with it. Okay. So after you create that second anchor, you're going to start dragging this up just a tad. I'm probably going to bring it up to about maybe 6% right there. Yeah, 6% looks good. Okay. And I've seen a couple people bring some of the whites down. I don't really like to do that, but you can if you want to. Maybe a little. Okay, so that looks good. All right, so now we're gonna move down to the HSL sliders. And we are gonna start messing around with the, we're gonna mess with the hue first. Actually scratch that, let's start with the saturation. So what I do is I drag everything down to where the entire thing is desaturated, just like this. And the first thing that I like to bring up are the oranges, the reds, the yellows, and I leave the greens and the blues last. Okay, so we want to kind of match that skin tone So let's drag this up. And when we do that, you start to see some of the skin tones are coming back in. So we'll bring it just a little above default right there. And I actually like to put red right at default. So if you double click on the word, so if I drag it back here and you double click, it resets it to default. You can do this as many times as you want on pretty much anything on this program. Okay, so I'm gonna drag the orange back where I had it. Okay, now I'm gonna slowly increase the yellows until I'm at a point where I get this nice, almost kind of like a pale, this pale look. Yeah, like right there. That looks pretty good. And you think that the grass is green and it would be on the green slider. It's actually on the yellows during sunset. So that's where most of your saturation and most of your hues are going to come from, is that yellow slider. Okay, so let's move down to green. You don't have to crunch it that much. Maybe about -53. That looks good. That looks good right there. And I typically leave the blues very low, or I leave them completely out of this. You can mess around with this as much as you want to. So some of the purples and the magentas are going to show up in the skin. So if we dial in right here, if we zoom in and start to increase some of the purples, you can't really notice it that much, but they are in the skin tones. So just be wary of that whenever you start messing with these sliders. Okay, but I think that's where I like it as far as saturation goes. So now let's move over to the luminance. And this is how you're going to help your subjects stand out. So generally skin tones are in the reds and in the oranges. So what I usually do is I come over here to the oranges and just drag it up. So as you can see, if I do this back and forth, everything starts to kind of light up. And I like to keep it about here. You don't want to overdo it because it kind of stretches the colors a little bit and things start to look kind of weird. So you don't want to get too crazy on that. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We can mess with some of the yellows. And this is entirely up to you how you want it to look. But I generally only mess with those 3 sliders and I leave the rest alone. Okay, and then finally we're going to move over to the hue. And this is where I like to mess with the skin tones a little bit further. So I kind of just guesstimate how I want the skin tones to look. Okay, so they actually look pretty okay. Maybe right there, +7 on the orange. And then for the yellow, I kind of just play around with this until I find something that I like. I generally push the yellows more towards the oranges to get that nice warm afternoon sunny sunset look. So maybe -16 looks pretty okay. So let's do a check real quick. Let's do a before and after and see where we started. So that's before, and this is after. You can already see that there is a major difference from where we started. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so we're gonna move the greens. What I typically like to do is, if you look in the shadows here, that's where you're gonna see a lot more of the greens. And this is where you can create this nice contrast between the yellows here, the highlights, and the darks and the greens. So I push it a little bit, not too much, but a little bit towards the blue. So it kind of creates this nice separation between the warms and the cools. Since we eliminated a lot of the blues, there's not really much we can work with here. So I'm gonna leave these at default, but you can play around with the sliders as much as you like. Okay, so now we're gonna move down to split toning. And split toning is essentially, as it says here, there's highlights and you can push them to any hue that you would like. So if I wanted the highlights to be more purple, all I have to do is drag the slider all the way to the purple and then slowly increase the saturation and we get some pretty funky looking colors. Okay, but we're not gonna do that. We're actually gonna increase some of the warmth that we see. I feel like this is more natural than using the temperature slider, because whenever you use the temperature slider, I want you to notice that when I start sliding it up, it starts to brighten the entire image. It looks good, but you're actually losing a lot of information when you do that, and we don't want to lose control like that. We want to have as much control over this as we can. So push it over just to the right, where it's right between the yellow and the red, and then slowly increase your saturation, and you can start to see that warmth come in nicely, just like that. See it? Before, after. and that looks pretty good. The other thing that I like to do is do the same thing with the shadows. I like to create a little bit of warmth in the shadows. So I'm going to put it almost in the exact same place, maybe a little bit closer to the reds. And I'm not going to push this too hard. We're going to go to about, let's go to 10. So the saturation is 15 on the highlights, and on the shadows, the saturation is 10. And that's looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and do a before and after check. Before, after. It's already looking really good. Okay, scrolling down just a little bit more. So I generally turn the sharpening all the way down. I don't want any kind of sharpening just yet. We're going to do that in the later stages, and we'll get to that. We're just doing the primary corrections right now. So I don't always use this, but depending on the lens that you have, if you use lens corrections, it's going to do this profile correction. I'll just show you what that does. So if I click this, it's going to take the metadata collected from my lens and my camera, and it's going to fix any kind of the warping in the edges. And sometimes it does a really good job. Sometimes it messes it up. So as you can see here, I was using a 70 to 200, 2.8. I'm actually going to leave that on just for the sake of this example, but I don't typically turn that on. I usually leave it at default. Okay, so scrolling down here, you can do a post-crop vignette, but as I said before, I like to have full control over what I'm doing, and whenever you add a vignette here, it applies it to all the sides, and even though it does look good, you don't have any control of where those shadows are taking place. But I'm going to show you a trick in just a minute on how to add your own vignette and not cover the entire place with shadows. Okay, so we're going to set that back to default, and we're going to scroll down. If you see grain, most people think, like, why would you want noise inside of your picture? Grain can actually hide a lot of the mistakes and a lot of these minor adjustments. It can help blend together some of the things that you might be trying on here, but I don't mess with a grain. That's up to you if you want to use that. And finally, we are here at color calibration. And what I like to do is, if you notice down here, the blue primary slider is essentially, this is going to give you that nice blue and teal look. So if we didn't edit anything at all, and let me just show you, I'm going to reset it. And I'm just going to take this all the way to the left. So as you can see, only the colors left are the oranges and teals. So that's what that does. And each of these sliders has separate functions. So if I slide this one here, it's going to mess with the different hues of the blues, the greens, and the reds. But just for this example, I'm going to go back to where we were. And I'm just going to take that blue primary hue and slowly drag it down to where I want it. So we started about here. Minus 25 looks good. You don't want to push it too much or it's going to look like straight garbage. We don't want to do that. So we're going to keep it pretty low. Like I said before, we want to have as much control over this as we can. Okay, so as far as color calibration goes, we've completed that there. So now what I want to do is I want to go back to the vignetting, and I also want to help you bring your subjects further from the background. I want there to be a clear separation between the background and your subject. So here's what I want you to do. If you look right here, there's this thing called the graduated filter. And the graduated filter essentially is like a gradient tool, and you can customize it any which way you want. So once you click on it, it's going to be highlighted just like this, and it's going to give you a new custom menu to work with. And you can mess with these sliders and nothing's going to happen at all until you click and drag. See how big of a dramatic difference that is? We don't want that. Okay, so we're going to reset all these, and we're going to slowly bring this in. Okay, so typically what I like to do is dial down the exposure to about -1. That's a good starting point. And then right after that, I just click and drag, and as you can see, shadows are coming in, and it's creating a very nice separation between the subject and the background. You have that kind of natural vignette, nothing's too out of the ordinary, I like to create these borders on the side. If you want it completely straight, all you have to do is hold shift and just drag it out. Another place I like to put it is kind of down here towards the bottom, just to add a little bit more separation. And as you can see, that's a lot better than the crop tool we were working with earlier. And at any time, if you want to change the previous gradient that you added, all you have to do is click on this little node and these lines will pop back up, and you can customize this and change anything you want to. So if you want to go super dark or if you want to go super light, you can change this at any time. Okay, so I'm going to keep it just at -1 right here. That's perfect. All right, so this is already looking really good. Let's just do a before and after check just to see where we are. Before, after. That's great, isn't it? Okay. One final thing that I like to do is, if you look right here, this kind of looks like a little wand. I'm not really sure why. It kind of looks like a slider. Like I just want to take this and slide it to the right. But it doesn't do that. You just click on it, and once again, you have your custom menu. Okay, so there's one thing I want you to notice about this. So down here, you have brush A, brush B, and erase. And as we go along, I'm going to show you what this does. But for right now, if you'll just select A, I want you to have the size around 7's pretty good. I like to have mine completely feathered out and the flow to be at 100%. Same for density, 100%. Okay? So what we're going to do is I want my subjects here to pop out from the background. So in order to do that, we need to make sure that they are lit up more. But we want it to look natural. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure the exposure starts at 0, and we're just going to bring it up just a bit. Right there looks good. And you can start to paint the subjects. You see how light they're showing up? I know it doesn't look natural, but we're going to fix this. One thing you can do to see where you're painting is pressing the O key on your keyboard, and after that this red shows up, and this is just showing you where you've previously painted. Okay, so I'm going to cover my subjects just like this. Don't worry about it being perfect. It doesn't need to be perfect. We're just going to go over them like this. If you have more time, of course. Okay, also you can use the bracket keys to make your size smaller and larger. So the left bracket is smaller and the right bracket is larger. And we're just gonna keep drawing. And like I said, it doesn't need to be perfect. We're gonna fix that in post. Okay. Get some of her hair. If you feel like you went over the lines just like this, whoop, hold Alt if you're on Windows, and that's gonna create the eraser. And you can change the size just like you did with the other one. So using the bracket key, and you can just paint back over where you went too far. So don't worry about messing up. You can take it away. Okay. So after we painted our subjects, we obviously don't want to see this red anymore. So go ahead and press the O key and we're back to normal. And right now they have this really terrible looking exposure. So we're going to fix that. We're actually going to take the exposure down back to where it is. So just double click it. And I'm actually going to start on the whites. So slowly drag the whites up. And that's going to create a nice separation from the subject and the background. See what that does? It's subtle and it's nice, and it's not as crazy as using the exposure. The other thing that I like to do is bring the blacks down just a tiny bit to kind of create a little bit of contrast between the subject and the background. And also adding a little bit of clarity. Mess around with the sliders. You don't have to do exactly what I'm doing. This is just my workflow. And I think that looks pretty good right there. Okay, so let's have a look. Let's hit done so we can get out of this menu. Make sure to hit done right here. Okay, and if you come over here, this is how you preview your before and after. So just give it a click. Wow, that's a huge difference, and that only took roughly like 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes. You can press it a couple times to see different before and after cues. And that's pretty much it. If you want to, so if you don't want to do this over and over, you can save this as a preset. And a preset is just a fancy way of saying filter. So if you want to save this preset, come up here to where it says presets, and you'll notice that there's a little plus sign to the right. So click on that, and you're gonna hit create preset. And make sure that everything you want to be saved is checked off. And we're gonna name this preset. So, and you can name it anything you want. I like to be pretty precise with my things. So I'm just gonna say, we'll just call this one golden hour. And then when everything looks good, you can save it under a different group or the user preset. That's entirely up to you. And then once everything looks good, just hit create. And then now, let's turn the before and after off. We're just gonna click this, and I'm gonna hit reset. And that is gonna bring us back to our default picture that we took straight off the camera. And if you notice right here, we created this preset, golden hour. Look at that, before, after, before, after. And all I have to do is click on it. So if there's another picture that's just like that, so we're gonna go here, we're gonna hit reset. And I'm gonna go over here to golden hour, the preset we just created together, and then boom, just like that. And of course, you don't want to just click the preset and then leave it as is. You're always gonna have to tweak it because every picture is different. But it is a good starting point to use. And then once you use a preset, you can start moving the sliders around and get to the finished product that you desire. Okay, so that is it. Thank you for watching my tutorial. I hope you liked it. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. This is my first tutorial, so if you liked it, leave me a little comment down below and ask or tell me if I should do this again. Other than that, that's it. Thank you so much. Bye.